Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I am the lead for the NBS Arable Systems chapter. So like the others, I'm the lead, and I've got a number of co-authors who I will recognise later. But Bethany asked, as I'd sort of done quite a bit of work with DEFRA, if I could sort of pick up on some of the policy issues that have led us towards wanting to look at nature-based solutions. So, as was pointed out by one of the earlier speakers, we now have our 25-year environment plan, which was launched in 2018, I think. And that was really the sort of major piece of movement from Theresa May's government to change the environment. And the key commitment was to leave the environment in a better state for the future generation. And I think that has combined with a number of other bills that have resulted from that, such as the Environment Bill and the Agriculture Bill, which basically give us a sort of pivotal moment, really, in the UK and the environmental management of the UK. So this has led to things that some of you may have heard of, such as the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is going to start paying for giving public money for public goods. So very much with the Common Agricultural Policy as it stood, we had the Basic Payment Scheme, which purely paid farmers on the land area they owned. There were things like countryside stewardship where you get top-up payments, but the majority of the money was purely land-based. But now with this public money for public goods drive, we'll be able to sort of pay farmers for maintaining soil health or improving water quality. And you'll notice that within the Environment Bill, it's very much focused around targets, and DEFRA is spending a lot of time with its different teams trying to devise what the appropriate targets are that they can put money behind. And one of those is enhancing biodiversity, which is clearly critical to what we're doing here with our different nature-based solutions. So very much a sort of moving set of policies coming through to underpin the adoption of nature-based solutions. So some of you may have seen this report from the Climate Change Committee looking at land use policy changes and how we might achieve net zero. And that's again responding to new legislation. We've now got an ambitious target in the UK of net zero by 2050. And I think the key thing that the Climate Committee identified, we need a holistic strategy. It was mentioned by Isabel earlier that we need to look at both biodiversity and climate change mitigation together and not see them separately. And they particularly sort of highlighted things about using functioning ecosystems for habitat and carbon capture, and trying to recognise that if we pursue a single objective, irrespective of wider consequences, we can have policy failures. And they highlight the agricultural policy of the CAP, which was very much initially focused on yield and didn't really look at the wider environmental benefits that we can get from our agricultural environments. So that's my overview of the policy background. So I think there's lots of interesting things happening, lots of positive things happening for the environment whereby NBS can play a significant role. So why are we focusing on our chapter on arable land? What's the rationale behind that? Well, arable farming constitutes 26% of the agricultural land in the UK. That's roughly 19 million hectares. It's under the most active management of most agricultural systems, and it gives us therefore an opportunity to improve our wider ecosystem service position. But we do need to be mindful that we've got to maintain food production, and that probably goes back to some of the comments of the earlier presenters about possibly using some of the low productive land for meat production and transferring that into other forms of production. And we must also note that changing diets with our increasing environmental and welfare awareness means we've got to expand cropland, so arable lands might actually expand if we're not going to offshore production and potentially cause harm in other areas of the world. So arable land is responsible for significant greenhouse gas emissions, both on and off farm. You've got to remember there's lots of greenhouse gas production in things like fertilizer. It's incredibly energy intensive. So there's a significant off-farm component to greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in arable agriculture. There's also issues around nitrous oxide releases as a consequence of fertilizer use, methane releases from waterlogged soils, and obviously peatland degradation in the lowland fens, which are our most productive areas for salad crops, for example, and usually they rotate that with wheat production, so it is arable land. And there's many studies saying that biodiversity has been profoundly impacted by arable farming, with reductions in farmland birds and insects, with specific sort of intensive practices of agriculture being given the blame. So as I say, I've got a host of co-authors. So Lisa, who spoke earlier, Lynn Dix from Cambridge, Gareth Morgan from the Soil Association, Pippa Chapman from Leeds, Alfie Galthorne Hardy from Edinburgh, who I think is on the line, so he can answer some questions around biochar should he wish, Nicola Randall from Harper Adams, and Jenny Roundtree from Manchester Metropolitan University. And we've focused on 6 NBS and how they address the greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity. So they're hedgerows, buffer strips, cover crops, biochar, biological control, and agroforestry. And I'm just going to focus on 3 of those today because of the limits of time. So starting with hedgerows, they're important as Lydia features. They enable connectivity. There was a mention of the Lawton report earlier and how we make space for nature. And one of the things they highlight in that report is the need to create connectivity across different patches in the environment. In one study, there was over 2,070 species were found in hedgerows on farm lowlands. So they're huge sort of reservoirs of biodiversity, and many priority bird species are associated with hedgerows. And we also know that butterflies and bees use hedgerows for navigation and follow along those. So very, very important for biodiversity. From the perspective of carbon storage and greenhouse gas mitigation, we know they can store up to 100 tonnes per hectare of carbon, and also that soils under hedgerows are very high in carbon compared to the neighbouring arable land, and they also enhance water storage and reduce migration by reducing erosion, so stop soil erosion across the field. Our second nature-based solution looks at buffer strips and field margins. And grassy margins, they host more species and higher numbers of insects than other biota compared to controlled field edges. We know that they also offer pollination services, so they're again refugia for those very important insects required for the pollination of crops, and also can enhance pest regulation. So again, important for biodiversity. From the greenhouse gas perspective, we know that these margins have up to 37% higher soil carbon in their top 30 centimetres compared to neighbouring arable fields. And again, they have secondary benefits, reducing surface and subsurface flows of nutrients and halting sediment entering streams where it can harm the wildlife in the stream or make purification of that water difficult for water companies. My final example is agroforestry, and we know that they're primarily targeting greenhouse gas mitigation, and they can sequester up to 63 megagrams of carbon per hectare. They also provide habitat akin to a well-managed hedgerow, and they can enhance the biodiversity of agronomically beneficial species such as spiders and carabid beetles. But most importantly, secondly, they also improve soil protection by reducing soil erosion and improve the utilisation of nutrients because they have a different root morphology that was also mentioned in one of the earlier talks. But another important aspect of agroforestry is it allows farmers to diversify, giving them a very more stable and sustainable income stream. So my final slide just shows how all these different things may potentially fit together. There's rather a lot going in this slide, but I think it does show how we need to integrate across the landscape. And Jenny Phillips from FWAG provided this slide for me. So you start off on the left-hand side by mapping the natural assets in the area, and you build up a sort of natural capital. You again go for advice and guidance and look to different streams of finance, such as green finance or carbon offsetting payments. And you link those to things like the Environmental Land Management Scheme, and you can build then a base map of natural capital. You can then use digital mapping techniques to map that across the land and how it might improve and where we place these different NBS in the landscape. That was raised by other presenters. And then we can have a meaningful natural capital map that can help local planning and educate the public and help further develop our policy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Chris, for giving us all hope about ways of improving arable landscapes for nature-based solutions.